I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I am Sunil Dasgupta. A few years ago, Montgomery County, Maryland set up a $100 million housing fund to buy into new mixed-income housing projects with low-cost capital and then using the equity to leverage as many affordable homes as possible. Call it the county's version of social housing. And it is an innovation in housing affordability. Seed money from a local government is used to secure more affordable units. Indeed, the seed money is used to pencil out private development projects stuck due to the lack of financing. The question is scale. Is there enough government-supplied seed money to produce sufficiently large numbers of new units to stabilize the housing affordability crisis affecting major metropolitan locations, including the Washington, D.C. area? This debate came right out in the open recently as the Westmore administration in Maryland targets housing policy with new affordability initiatives, including expedited review of new projects using the federal low-income housing tax credits, LIHTC as they are called. Criticism from housing advocates sees this approach as overly narrow, and given the financial constraints of governments, argued that the best way to affordability is housing deregulation that energizes the private sector to build more market-rate housing rather than more regulation requiring ever more affordable units, which is what has contributed to constricted supply. Montgomery County's housing fund seems like a middle ground where money from government-issued bonds is used in private projects outside of low-income tax credits to bring the capital cost down and secure more affordable units in an otherwise market-rate housing project. I talked with the fund's manager, Zach Marks, of the Housing Opportunities Commission, which is both the county's public housing authority and housing finance agency. Stick around to find out how those two functions combined to produce an innovation in local social housing. I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are dirty, messy, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from it, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society functioning precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode has a long story. In 2022, Congress passed a new law called the Music Modernization Act, which removed copyright protection from artistic works more than 100 years ago on a rolling basis. In 2022, that brought Winnie the Pooh and the Great Gatsby into the public domain. In 2023, there was a technical legal hiatus, but January 2024 has brought all recordings from 1923 into the public domain. You can download, remix, and reuse them freely. There are exceptions. Only recordings made in 1923 are in the public domain. Not a later 1932 recording of a song, for example, which will only be available in the public domain in 2033. We cleaned up the recordings as best as we could. If you want to know more about public domain and artistic works, go to Duke University's Center for the Study of the Public Domain. This is a 1923 song called Wolverine Blues by the Benson Orchestra of Chicago. In the news this week, respiratory illness hospitalizations in Maryland were 19.7 for every 100,000 in population, up from 16.8 the previous week. Anything over 10 cases per 100,000 calls for broad source control or masking. The director of school health in the state's Department of Health is calling for universal masking for school nurses and anyone in the nurses' room. EMS personnel in the state and healthcare facilities are already masking. If you are in congregate settings, you may like to consider masking as well. The Maryland budget document dropped January 17th. It is well known by now that the state faces a $1.1 billion deficit for the fiscal year 2024-25 and a structural deficit of $761 million. Structural deficit is a measure of the mismatch between projected expenses on the current trend line and changing revenue estimates. A structural deficit is resolved by cutting expenses or adding new taxes. The 2024-25 state budget does not propose new taxes, and the deficit is proposed to be covered almost entirely through spending cuts and some moving around of monies held for different purposes, for example, the Rainy Day Fund. The Fair Share campaign in Maryland has been pushing for closing some tax loopholes for rich residents and corporate subsidiaries, and believes that legislators remain interested in finding new revenue sources. A bill is in the works for Montgomery County Delegate Julie Polakovich-Carr and Baltimore Delegate Shelley Heddleman. If the legislature were to pass tax measures, the governor would probably not oppose, but no new taxes from the governor himself. In his letter introducing the budget, Governor Moore says that his administration is redirecting funds that were often left stagnant by underused programs and adjusting spending on programs that have grown at unsustainable levels over the last few years. The biggest cuts, $3.3 billion, have come from transportation, and these were announced already before the budget was released. This puts the governor in the difficult position of claiming that state transportation funds were being underused or had grown unsustainably. Since the transportation cuts have hit transit most of all in both the capital spending and in operations, it does hurt the governor's robust support for climate goals for the state. Montgomery County Delegate Mark Corman, who chairs the House Environment and Transportation Committee, has been critical of this approach and has said that the budget has some useful one-time reprieves. But this is the fifth year in a row across two governors that have used one-time infusions for transportation. We previewed transportation funding with Delegate Corman in October 2023 in episode 139. That episode is called Why Does Westmore's Transportation Plan Look Like Hogan's? Now that texts of bills in the state assembly have started to come out, I reached out to Cecilia Plant of the Maryland Legislative Coalition to get a jump start on what's going on.
Right now, we're looking at a sample set that is the pre-filed bills that came out about a week ago. Those bills, generally, there's about 640 of them. They contain bills of every stripe, every possible topic. A lot of the bills that came out first that have hearings are environmental bills. There's a few housing bills thrown in there. But there's also, many other topics such as tax cuts, wage bills, all kinds of things. There's still the bills on policing and so forth. But a lot of the ones that got hearings that got in there first are the environmental and the housing bills.
Which are the standout environmental bills?
The biggest one that I've seen so far is the Renewable Energy Portfolio Standard Bill, which is trying to take incineration out of our clean energy portfolio, which makes a lot of sense because incineration is in no way clean energy.
What about the housing bills you're looking at?
There's a couple of them. None of them are really huge bills at this point, but I think they're going to add up. And a lot of the bills are trying to get at affordable housing. There is a huge shortfall of affordable housing in Maryland. Young people can't afford to live on their own, honestly. The first one is the Housing Innovation Pilot Program, Von Stewart's bill. And it creates a pilot program that rewards counties that are doing creative things with affordable housing. They have to meet some criteria. So 20% of the units have to be essentially for low-income housing folks, but they're mixed income. So what happens is the people that are not needing low-income housing are essentially helping pay back the loan. So it's a loan that is paid back based on the housing, the folks that pay the higher prices for the housing.
Anything else that we should take into account as we look forward to next week?
We are in the uphill slide of the session. So what's going to happen is we're going to start being deluged with bills. I think the thing you have to watch with anything that goes in this year is what is the fiscal note. If it is a study, probably won't get done. If it is considered not a hot button issue, probably won't get done. They're going to focus on the things that they have to focus on, and they have a lot to focus on this year. Other big bills that we know are coming, there is and it is a study, but we all want it. It's the study for universal health care. We would like to see that happen. We're hoping they can find money for the study. And the End of Life Act is coming back this year.
Do you know how much money is required for the study for universal health care?
When they put the fiscal note in past years, they assumed that there was a commission that was bigger than the Kirwan Commission, which no one thought was realistic. So we're waiting to see what the fiscal note will be this year, but we were told last year that it would be more reasonable to the study. We're hopeful it's a lot cheaper.
Thanks, Cecilia.
Thanks, Sunil.
You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. I'll be back with Zach Marks, Real Estate Development Director in Montgomery County's Housing Opportunities Commission, who manages a $100 million housing production fund on behalf of the county. This next song from 1923 is Moonshine Blues by Ma Rainey.
My head going round and around me. There's my daddy there now. I don't know the river running up or down. But that one thing certainly, Mama's going to leave town.
Zach Marks, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
You are the Director of Real Estate Development for Housing Opportunities Commission, which is Montgomery County's public housing authority as well as housing finance agency. So, can you explain what is unique about what it is that you do?
Yeah, thank you. So one of the pillars of this strategy, one of the keys to it, is that it's intended to be in addition to what the private sector is doing. It's intended to be in addition to what the nonprofit and even HOC is doing with the usual affordable housing tools. The primary one is, of course, the low-income housing tax credit. There is a certain allocation every year of low-income housing tax credits. Everybody's already using them, effectively all up, and short of Congress showing up with 2 or 3 times as much in the way of capacity, it isn't scalable. The state, county, and even at the federal level are already stretching that existing capacity as far as it will go. And so what's unique about this particular approach is that it's controlled entirely at the county level. So we don't have to wait for the federal government to fix the low-income housing tax credit issue around scalability. We don't have to wait for the state to show up. So this gives us the freedom to move forward with a solution at the local level.
What is the gap that you're trying to fill?
There are a few hundred units a year, maybe, of low-income housing tax credit units produced in Montgomery County, maybe 200 to 400 units. The low-income housing tax credit is producing about right around 5% of what the county needs annually, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less.
What is your goal in terms of how much you want to achieve?
We're getting close to doubling what we're getting out of the low-income housing tax credit program. The production fund is for mixed income deals. So we're also getting a whole bunch of other housing units that are not affordable units. They're unrestricted units, all combined in one community. And that's where you get further another 5% plus toward the county's housing goals. So, if you look at each year, annually speaking, you look at each year and see that we're usually failing somewhere between 20% and 40%, falling short of our housing goals. Under our current fund balance, we are able to take about 5 to 10%, off that shortage, which is good. It's good as a first step.
The mixed income deal seems literally like an extension of the inclusive zoning regime that was put in place in the early 70s.
That's a good framework to think about this, is that in some ways, it's just simply HOC choosing to do, double the inclusionary zoning standard in its own buildings and financing them and moving forward in terms of like just trying to do an accelerated, IZ inclusionary zoning approach. There was an era where HOC was buying a lot of townhomes around the county back in the 80s and 90s. And that's what HOC was doing, was actually buying the inclusionary zoning, the MPDU units, bringing them into its portfolio and renting them. It's just a series of innovations on, a lot of the existing programs to try to, create a bigger effect.
So you're getting 30% of the units as a result of your capital investment?
Yeah. So the proposal here is that you're basically getting units you might not get at all, period, for financing reasons. And then instead of doing the standard, which, in some parts of the county is still 12.5%, but in a lot of parts of the county has moved to 15%, you're basically getting twice that. You're getting 30%. In addition, within that 30, we're doing 2/3 of the 30, or 20% of the units are actually being set at rents at 50% of the area median income. The MPDU standard is usually around 65 or 70%. Our second housing production fund deal, which is under construction now over in Hillendale, is, we've actually exceeded the standard that we've created for the fund on both deals, but on both the first 2 deals. But the second deal, we've got close to 53% restricted across the entire communities.
So how many units does HOC hold?
So we currently own about 9,500 units. It's not been just a 45-degree angle for the history of HOC. We've really added several thousand over the last, call it 6 to 8 years. So we should get over 10,000 in the next year or so.
The Council of Governments has said that not only do we need 75% more affordable units, but also that 75% of them should be within the activity centers or transit-oriented development. Do your projects overlap on both those categories? I mean, I would imagine that there is some contradiction between those two.
I do know that when the Council of Governments talked, I do hear the data point that in addition to here's the number of units you need, 75% of them have to be affordable. But I believe under their definition, affordable is something like 120% of AMI or 100% of AMI. So
what is HOC's levels of affordability?
At our Hillendale deal, there's 463 total units. There are 25 or 5% are at 30%. Another 5% are at 40%. Another 14% are at 50%. So you're basically at about 25% are at or below 50, including a chunk at 30 and a chunk at 40. So you're getting 25, 30% units and 25, 40% units in Hillendale, along with a bunch of other stuff.
You are able to move things faster on the regulatory scene because you're a government agency. How does that work? Is it just purely permitting, or is it also about impact taxes? Are you getting some benefits around those things as well?
We don't get anything in terms of like rubber meets the road on the project side. We go through the same tough entitlement process. We go through this, we go through all the same rules everybody else does. If we're getting, if we're getting an impact fee waiver, it's because we got it under the county law that's available to anybody that did affordability of the required level to get that certain level of exemption. So
what is that level of exemption?
So there are, I think it's still 25% MPDUs. And then, of course, the adjustment they made is that it used to be if you did that, you got the full exemption, but they changed it to, which I think made some sense, around you still get 100% if you're in a place like Bethesda or downtown Silver Spring, because the infrastructure there is so good that your impact fees are relatively low. Most places in the county get a 50% exemption if you do 25% because there's some good infrastructure there, but we don't want to fully exempt projects because we know places like Hillendale and mid-county, some up-county that still for sure need that infrastructure investment. The reason the low-income housing tax credit program is so layered with regulation is this general idea that if you work for the government and it turns out you gave too nice a benefit to the private sector, you're going to wind up on the front page and it's going to be terrible. That's so much of what makes these affordable housing programs take so long. But HOC and the county are able to do things faster if there isn't that fear, right? Let's say the worst thing that happens, you create something for HOC and it turns out it's this amazing windfall program. Well, guess what? It's all still stuck inside HOC.
Your construction costs are the same as private companies. Your impact taxes are generally the same as private companies. So the only difference that you bring is cost of capital. Is that correct?
Yeah. So it is first and foremost the HPF idea, the big switch you're getting, because really what we're doing is we're taking the usual conventional model, and by conventional I just mean private for-profit sector model, is you want to build one of these new Class A developments, you go get a construction loan from private bank. I don't want to name anybody specific for whatever reason, but all the banks you do your banking at, you go get the construction loan, and then you usually get the rest of your money from what's usually called a private equity investor, right? So you would go get, usually 30 to 40% of the capital you need to build your building, and they charge 15 to 20% for that money. In addition to that, they also charge, if a deal does better than that, some do, they actually get some of that too. And so the big value proposition of the Housing Production Fund is, hey, we shouldn't give all that value away to the private equity investor, and so instead we should really keep it with HOC. We should keep it with public ownership,
So you've made the case that there are sort of ready to go projects that are then HOC can step in, provide the equity money at low rates that makes that project viable. But surely 30 to 40% of the equity is a big number. So for Hillendale, for example, what would it be?
$35 million.
So $35 million, about 25 of it coming from the Housing Production Fund, I imagine, and 11 directly from the Housing Opportunity.
Oh, sorry.
Commission.
35 is the Housing Production Fund number.
Oh, so and
So,
then
so 50-ish is the number. Yeah, the gross number you're talking about. Yeah, it's closer to $50 million.
what is the total number of units you're getting for that?
463.
Do you think it's all worthwhile then?
We think it's crucially important that at times like right now, where there are really high quality housing developments that are in danger of, instead of starting this year and delivering in 2 years to house people, get delayed for 2 years and then are under construction for 2 years, and instead are displacing the resources of those future years that were needed for that. The cumulative impact puts you so far behind that we do think, one, getting deals that are ready to close and start production is absolutely vital. So that's part one. The second thing is, that's important feature of this Housing Production Fund is that $35 million investment is a revolving investment. So it's only in the project for up to 5 years. So the production fund is designed to act as the construction period equity, not forever. So unlike, for instance, and this is one of my favorite threads on the whole sweater. Every single tax credit deal that gets done in Montgomery County and in most counties across the country gets a soft loan from the county, whether it's the Housing Trust Fund or the Housing Initiatives Fund, whatever they call it, right? Gets a soft loan, and that funding is gone for 30 years at least, right? There's just no way it's coming back for 30 years. And that's the way it works. And what we're saying when we design this program is, instead, it's only going to go into these projects for up to 5 years. And then when the projects are constructed and leased up, we put permanent financing in place, pays the fund back, and that fund can then be loaned out into the next transaction. And so that
where is the permanent financing coming from?
In most cases, it's coming from HOC. When you're in the construction period of a transaction, normally, so on the private side, if you went to a bank and said, I need a loan to build my transaction, most banks are going to tell you, I'll give you 50 to 60 cents of what you need. And that's it. You got to go with this big number, right? The reality is, once that building's built, it's extremely valuable. It's not only worth what it was built for, almost the second the doors open, particularly in housing scarce markets, it's immediately worth a lot more. And banks will take the construction hat on, they'll put their permanent hat on, usually on behalf of an agency, so like Fannie and Freddie, and they'll say, oh, this is leased up, it's stabilized, there's no construction risk here, this is a much safer asset, we'll give you 70%, 75, 80% if you're over what it took to build the deal. And so that's the way the private model largely works, is that there's this huge discrepancy between what you can get for a senior loan for construction and lease up versus what you can get once that property is fully what's called stabilized, which is just occupied enough to pay all the bills, right, including debt service. So that is the first piece where the HPF or private equity, in the case of the private model, is having to make up for a big chunk of debt that the bank would otherwise give you if this project were already built and stabilized. So all we're doing, once we're stabilized and we can put in place a larger permanent, totally supported by the operations and the numbers and everything, it can just be bigger because of the way in which banks look at construction loan risk and lease-up risk. And then what you add on top of that is that HOC is basically a tier 1, tier 2 approved HUD lender. So on behalf of HUD, HOC, and this is 40 years of this, HOC can come to stabilized assets, oftentimes usually our own, and we can then put an FHA insured fixed rate long-term mortgage, permanent phase mortgage on the property, and it's whatever the property will support at that point.
Essentially, take a mortgage.
Yeah, it's just once you're stabilized, you can access a completely different pot of very ordinary financing tools, and it allows you to pay the housing production fund, gets paid back the money, and then we turn around and we loan it to the next deal.
This idea of counter-cyclical building, to what extent do you think you're actually being able to do that? And I bring that up in particular because right now the issue is about converting office buildings into residential buildings. Is that something that you're interested in? And can you act in the same way there?
So we don't see much scalability in the office conversion approach, primarily because, and we spent a lot of time talking to folks that have done office conversions. Most offices, it comes down to the depth of the way in which office buildings are designed. It's really hard to convert them to residential, and frankly, these days the cost, it used to be that you could generally kind of assume some level of cost savings versus something else, another approach, but these days you can't even assume a cost savings around the conversion. But so we don't look at that approach very often. Maybe one off here and there. We see much more in the way of production coming from moving transactions forward that the business cycle has stalled, that we're going to get way more bang for our buck just helping projects, new communities come online when they were sort of supposed to, right? Rather than losing 2 to 3 years. The other thing it does, because your question is very reasonable, and we're very realistic about it. Do we think we're changing the nature of the construction labor market right now? We don't think that, but scaled enough, we can change behaviors. And again, right now we're just talking at the county level. We're not changing the world, but at the county level, we know we can change behaviors because developers will be more interested in developing in Montgomery County if they know that despite what is usually a 2 to 3 year entitlement process, that they don't have the roulette wheel spinning in terms of what kind of economy they wind up having to finance themselves in. And so if there's an understanding that, hey, there's a likelihood that HOC and the county are going to see the benefit of my new housing and try to make it happen, I'm more likely to want to do business here. Additionally, as it relates to construction trades, 2008, and again, the danger of that kind of an environment, that downturn, many people left the construction trades forever during the downturn. So one of the reasons construction costs are so high right now is labor, because I don't think we're even back to to the levels of construction employment that we were at back then. I think that destruction is still not remedied. And so one of the things we can do is keep people working in the county. We're still in an environment where construction companies will fight over a certain subcontractor and try to get them to come to their site and not somebody else's. And if they can they will take teams from one deal that they're working on with you, and if they know they have another one starting with you right behind it, they'll actually shift the whole team. And it's one of the ways they strategically use as construction companies for their own reasons to keep from losing subs to that other GC who is trying all the time to steal that subcontractor. So there is great value, both small and large, to keeping housing production going in economic environments where the private sector and even to an extent the nonprofit sector are having to pause activities.
One thing that I would like you to address, Emery Grove and Hillendale, both of those places are transit challenged, right? In Hillendale, I know several people have died on New Hampshire Avenue. How do you deal with that?
Most of the developments we work on, we have a strong focus on TOD. Hillendale actually does have, we are, as part of this, we are improving, nowhere to go up, but we're improving the transit access. There is a major bus stop at Hillendale Gateway. We are building a new, as part of this, and there is an ability, developers have the ability to just write the check for infrastructure improvements, but not do them. And then when it happens, can be anybody's guess. So we're building, but we don't want to do that for exactly the reason you've highlighted. We don't want people to think, oh, HOC did this, and now Powder Mill intersection is the last place on earth I want to be, or I can't cross this. It was already bad to cross New Hampshire, which it was. I mean, Hillendale Gateway was Holly Hall Apartments. Holly Hall Apartments was home to 96 deeply affordable senior apartments, and so which we had for we think HOC built it in 1965, and so before I think like almost concurrent with the Beltway, we had to figure out ways to get our seniors safely to places because there was no way they were making it across, New Hampshire before the Red Hand. No way, right? So there's a few things we're doing. But there's way more to be done. We are putting in a new 3-bay bus transfer station for ride-on. And I think we do get some Metro too at the property. So it's right there, right along the northern frontage of our property. Additionally, we lobbied heavily to get the future BIT station at Hillendale Gateway, so that the future BRT station will be at Hillendale Gateway. We actually designed the stop so it's adjacent to our site because there's a question of whether it's in the middle of the road or on our side, and obviously that's not our decision. We just simply lobbied. And then in terms of the pedestrian piece, we're adding, like most new developments do, we're adding a ton of pedestrian infrastructure. But the problem is because most of the non-CBD infrastructure, whether it's for cars, people, or bikes, or whatever, totally reliant on new development. That's just the suburban model for the U.S. And the problem with a place like the East County, that was basically nothing happened in the last 40 years, is that you're also not getting any new infrastructure because nobody's developing. That's beginning to change. But there's a lot to be done. There's a great piece of pedestrian infrastructure that starts north of Powder Mill and connects to FDA. And so that's something we're looking at too, is how do we tie into that?
Right. You want to go to Safeway. Bringing BRT will make it worse to go to Safeway. So
in terms of the crossing pedestrian.
Yeah, in terms of,
yes.
it's just terrible. So the question I have for you is actually this, is that, the lack of transit or unsafe pedestrian pathways actually makes property cheaper, more affordable.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But it is less desirable in this other way.
Right.
So how are you balancing affordability and transit in that way? Or is it just purely based on opportunity?
We approach all of our developments as not just focused on housing. We view housing as like the platform, and then what can we layer on top of that furthers the county's goals and makes the community better. And transit is always a part, like what can we do to improve pedestrian, bike, and overall congestion? What can we do to help? And we never don't do those things. And it's just a part of what we do. And so to your point, it makes it harder to finance, but that's one of those things that just has to be above the line, so to speak. And so in every transaction, every development we've done, we've gone into the community, we've tried to understand the issues as much as possible, although in most cases we're already there and we already know the issues, like in the case of Hillendale Gateway. And so we just try to do as much as possible. So we're putting 7 figures of infrastructure improvement around, multimodal transit for Hillendale Gateway. We put a bunch of ideas out there. We try to also be a little bit of an organizer where we say, if there are other people in the community that have great ideas, we try to platform them and say, hey, that's a great idea. HOC is ready to help.
So, just to the south of us in the district, Mayor Bowser created a $500 million fund as opposed to a $100 million fund. How's that going? Do you want that money?
We would certainly be able to put to work additional housing production fund. We can show people, show people the deals. It's how we did it the first time around when the council, allocated enough. And to be clear, this is, and I won't go down this avenue if we don't have enough time, but one of the other really great features of the housing production fund is how little. So we're saying it's $100 million production fund. The county did not give us $100 million. They are paying the principal and interest on the bond issuance that HOC issued to create the fund. As an example of why this is important, our projects pay that 5%, right? So first 50 million, and then I'll talk about the second 50 because it's a different interest rate environment. So first 50 million we issued back in 2021. That we issued that bond in August, and the county is paying $3 million a year for 20 years to support the $50 million bond that created the first 50 million of the housing production fund. However, the projects are paying the fund 5%. 5% of 50 million is 2.5 million. And particularly because of where we were at the time and we're still very much in the throes of the pandemic, we agreed to send the county the 2.5 million on an annual basis. So the county is on net paying $500,000 a year for 20 years. And then after 20 years, they don't pay anything, but the fund continues to revolve because it's a revolving fund. And by the way, if people don't believe it, there are actually smaller HOC funds that were created by the county 30 years ago that work precisely this way. And the county hasn't been paying, county generally only does 20-year bonds. So after 20 years, the county hasn't paid for some of these funds. They're much smaller and for different purposes, but they haven't paid for them in 10 years. And they're now effectively free and continuing to revolve and continuing. So that's important. And even today, so if you issued at today's rates, the county would probably have to pay something like maybe 4 million a year. And so, but they'd still be getting the 2.5. So at 1.5 million per year on net, they'd be supporting an additional 50 million of revolving housing production fund. And so this is why it's so important, the difference between the normal affordable housing model of you give a tax credit deal a loan for 30 years and you don't see that money again for 30 years. So it's literally gone and out the door with something that's both revolving, but also creates the ability to pay enough back to the fund to offset much of the cost of of providing the fund itself. So it's really, there are many pieces to this production fund. It can't be scalable if you're coming to the county every 2 years and asking them for $50 million. It doesn't work that way, right? There's too much need, and it's a huge number. But the way in which we designed this was to say that, oh, you mean all I'm really appropriating on an annual basis is $1 million, but I'm getting this effect. So that's, so in terms of like, do I want more money? Absolutely. We think we've built a structure that really works. There are some innate pieces of this production fund that are practical, they're realistic, and they accomplish the P part, the production part. That's the hard part. It's really hard to produce affordable housing, produce housing in the DMV, and a lot of that is because we have to make some trade-offs. You talked about some of them earlier around transit and stuff like that, which for us is not a trade-off, but there are other things that we have to balance. We have to balance keeping the fund practical and realistic while still achieving enough that we think it's worth doing.
Zach Marks, thank you for taking the time to explain the Housing Production Fund.
My pleasure.
You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. I'll be back with a wrap-up of my conversation with Zach Marks of the Housing Opportunities Commission.
Tell me, pretty daddy, What's the matter now? Are you trying to quit me and you don't know how?
That's Ida Cox and her blues serenaders from 1923 with Lordy Lordy Blues. You're listening to I Hate Politics. I'm Sunil Dasgupta. What lessons can we draw from my conversation with Zach Marks, the Real Estate Development Director at Montgomery County's Housing Opportunities Commission, who manages the county's Housing Production Fund? The HOC's Housing Production Fund is an innovative way in which the government, and in this case the local government, can use its authority to become a market player in the really tough world of affordable housing. One complaint that Montgomery County Executive Mark Elrich has had of private developers is that they like to build high-end homes, not affordable ones. They are constrained by regulations and the market, and even the county executive cannot force the hands of private companies. So, what's to be done? The Housing Opportunities Commission was established in 1966 as the housing authority of Montgomery County to build and buy public housing. The county was one of the pioneers in what is called inclusionary zoning. The idea that when a developer builds a new project, they be required to build a certain number of affordable homes. The HOC would accept those homes at a predetermined lower cost and rent them out at below market rates to low-income families. This is also called the Moderately Priced Dwelling Unit, or the MPDU program. The percentage of units earmarked has grown now to 15, and where HOC provides funding, which comes at lower rates, they are able to extract even higher percentages. Zach Marks said that HOC currently holds close to 10,000 units, making it one of the largest landlords in the county. But numbers are just not enough. The primary instrument for building and buying affordable homes has been the Low-Income Housing Tax Credits, LIHTC. But there was never enough of these to meet the demand. On an average, the county built about 200 units every year, or 5% of the projected demand. The Housing Production Fund is a market intervention by the county government. It raised money by issuing bonds, which is then invested in a mixed income project at a low interest rate. Once the building is ready, HOC refinances it with a bank or another financial institution based on the rent income from the building. Only some of the units are low rent, and the aggregate rent can then meet the mortgage repayment obligation. The refinancing releases the money, which can then be invested in another project. The cycle is roughly 5 years. HOC has completed one project called the Laureate and is now working on a second one called the Hillendale Gateway on New Hampshire Avenue and the Capital Beltway. Importantly, these projects are not subject to the limits or the bureaucratic constraints of LIHTC, Low-Income Housing Tax Credit funded projects. Contrast this with the proposals of the Maryland state government on housing, which are focused on LIHTC and affordability standards. The details are yet to come from the Moore administration, but it seems that HOC's Housing Production Fund is a very different business model. The HOC takes an opportunistic approach, working out affordability standards that allow otherwise market rate projects to move ahead, thereby getting both affordable and market rate units. But the state, it seems, wants to focus on affordability more narrowly, raising viability concerns about projects, and demanding deeper levels of government subsidy. The HOC's approach adds 200 more units annually at a cost of about $2 million to the county. To produce the same number in the state plan in a high-cost location such as Montgomery County seems like it will take more money and involve longer financing commitment instead of the revolving structure that Zach Marks explained. Put simply, something is better than nothing. Questions remain about the scalability of Montgomery County's own approach. Meeting 10% of affordable housing demand is a low bar. Government alone, notwithstanding HOC's success, is going to build at a scale that meets the current housing shortage. To actually meet the shortage, the private sector has to step in, and it must be incentivized to step in, which means that private companies make more profit. The question of housing comes down to politics in another way. The scale at which new housing must be built requires state and local governments to open land use to dense apartment living where there are now single-family homes. This is the holy grail of zoning reform, which neither the county nor the state are seriously considering. That's all for this episode of I Hate Politics, where we aim to stem the decline in local news by working with community voices. I Hate Politics is produced by me, Sunil Dasgupta, and assistant producers Daniel Gallio and Katarina Gasek, with support from University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I direct UMBC's political science program at the universities at Shady Grove in Montgomery County, where, among other things, we explore and learn about politics and government and society close to home. Music for this episode comes from 1923. Sound recordings from that year entered the public domain on January 1st, 2024. You can listen to old American tunes from the National Jukebox collection of the Library of Congress. We are going out with Walter Donaldson and Gus Kahn with Making Whoopee. If you want to share your music on the show or know someone else who might want to, please email us at producer@ihppod.org. I hope you will subscribe and share the podcast as we bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.
Another year, or maybe less. What's this I hear? Well, can't you guess? She feels neglected, and he's suspected of making whoopee. She sits alone most every night. He doesn't phone, he doesn't write. He says he's busy, but she says, is he? He's making whoopee. He doesn't make much money, only $5,000 a per. Some judge who thinks he's funny says you pay $6 to her. He says, now judge, suppose I fail. The judge says, budge, right into jail. You better keep her, you'll find it cheaper than making